painting space, both physically and mentally and emotionally, is almost like a sacred space, and you kind of have to get into that space and get into that zone. And I have a few ways of doing that. One is making sure that I have kind of carved out this little block of time, at least. I'm a painter just in this little moment, and I can leave everything else behind. My name's Tom Shepherd. I'm predominantly a watercolour painter. I love painting a little bit of everything, and I'm here today in the Jackson studio to talk to you about my work, my processes, and my materials. I always loved drawing when I was younger. I didn't like painting at all. I didn't like colour, wasn't interested in it. And whilst I did want to explore the idea of being an artist, it didn't really seem like a viable option. So I went off in the direction of studying geography at university. But my kind of drawing was always in the back of my mind. I was always doing little bits of it. And then after doing a little bit of travelling after uni, I had to work out what I was going to do with my life, and much to the pain of my parents, I decided that I was going to try and become an artist with absolutely no training, no idea how to make a living whatsoever, and I kind of just dove straight into it, which in many ways I think is the best way to approach stuff. I started off painting artwork on guitars because I thought nobody's possibly going to want to buy a painting of mine, so if I can trick them into buying something else, i.e. a guitar with my work on it, thought that might be a viable option. And it kind of took me off in an interesting tangent for a few years, kind of really got stuck into the kind of music scene and guitar making. But I always had the calling to get back to actually just painting on canvas. And for a series of circumstances, I then ended up doing like a small apprenticeship with an artist where I learned oil painting, kind of alla prima oil painting. That introduced me to the world of what I would call like fine art and representational art. And then from there, I kind of drifted along. I started doing a little bit of teaching, drifted into acrylics, and in the last 5 or 6 years, I kind of moved to watercolour. And for me, watercolour is where I would say that I've kind of really found my artistic voice. That's where a few different things all came together and connected, and that's why I'm loving watercolour at the moment. This is my standard watercolour setup. I've got my paper here. Sometimes I like to stick a single sheet onto a board with masking tape. However, I'm a huge fan of these gummed blocks. I don't really work at an easel. I tend to work on a board or on a nice gummed block, which is like working on a board with a sheet. And I generally like to work at quite a steep angle, so about 45 degrees or so, to allow the paint to kind of flow down the page, and it opens you up for all of these interesting effects that can happen when you're a little bit more upright. And also if you've got a board, you can kind of pick the painting up when it's wet and move it around and move the pigment around. It really is just a board propped up on some books, not the most professional thing, but with that, take a book out and adjust the angle and all of that sort of thing, so it kind of works. And if possible, I like to work standing up, particularly in watercolour, because I find it to be kind of a very expressive medium, and I like to work in this kind of looser, more painterly way. I find that standing up and slightly away from the painting, it keeps you looking at the painting as a whole, rather than homing in on individual bits a little bit too much. I think when you home in on a small area, you can often do so at the cost of the whole painting, and the whole painting is always more important than the individual parts. So standing up for me kind of brings me back and away from it, and it allows me without thinking to step away from the painting. In terms of brushes, I've got my kind of selection of mop brushes. These are all the pan art brushes. They've got this gigantic kind of body here which holds tons of water and pigment. It really gets everything flowing really nicely, but you also get this excellent fine point when you need to home in on smaller areas. If I do need any finer details, it kind of depends on the painting. It's kind of a standard round, I would call it, a pointed round, also by pan arts. I've always grown up loving wildlife and loving birds, so I paint a lot of those subjects purely because I love them, but then I tie that in with loving the light and loving watercolour as a medium, and it becomes this lovely kind of holistic package of just fun and experimentation. Now, the way I lay out my palette is a really important thing for me. I don't think it matters how you do it, but I think once you've found a way that works for you, being consistent is a good idea, because you want things to become kind of second nature and more intuitive. There's certain things we don't want to be thinking about as much because we want to be focusing more on the painting. So if we know where everything is, it almost becomes second nature. So when it comes to actual colours that I like using, I kind of have what I would call like my core set of colours, which is quite small, and with students I always recommend they start with this core set of colours, and for me that's like a split primary So you have a cool and a warm of each primary, basically giving you 6 colours. And then from there you can kind of expand a little bit, start to explore your colours. And then for me, I'm forever like swapping colours out. I always love exploring colours. Obviously I've got my absolute favourites though, like I am a huge fan of Indian yellow. I'm a total sucker for kind of warm yellows. A bit of red in there really pushes it towards orange, that kind of thing. That dominates a lot of my paintings. And then always looking to experiment with granulation a little bit more. So the Daniel Smith colours in particular, they've got all of these amazing colours that granulate, do very, very interesting things. I'm finding as I've got more comfortable with colour mixing, I am slowly bringing in more unusual colours and feel a lot more brave and comfortable doing that. I think one of the biggest bits of advice though is don't change everything at once. So I tend to just swap out 1 or 2 colours at a time so that there's some sort of consistency with the other colours. I think that's always a good way to go. So I'm going to be painting a leopard, and you can see that I've drawn it out first. I do tend to draw out first for most of my paintings. What I found as time has gone on the last few years is my drawings used to be quite complicated and they had all of the information in there, and nowadays I found my drawings, there's less and less information in there, and I find that I like to sort of discover the painting as I'm going a little bit more. The drawing out of the painting, whilst it's not overly complicated, is an important element for me to get me in the mind, because I'm starting to study the subject. I'm going to start thinking about the way that I'm painting it. My mind's kind of easing into the process. I don't plan my paintings massively, but I might be starting to think about where the different blocks of tone are going to be, when am I going to work very wet into wet. But I don't overthink it. But I find that just kind of, how would I describe it? It's like the gateway into the painting. So the way I'm going to tackle this is the way I tackle a lot of my subjects, and you can obviously break out of this framework, but I'm going to do my light family first. So this for me is the whites of the page and any of the lighter tones within the subject, maybe drifting into a few of the spots within the light side of the animal. I'm then going to let that dry completely, and we're going to go through a simple process where I come in and establish the large, gentle shadow shapes. While those shadow shapes are still wet or damp, I'm going to start pushing towards the deeper shadows, so you'll see quite a specific process. For me, when I'm painting, I love the balance between the more kind of logical and kind of mind-based stuff, if you want to call it that. That's your kind of theory, your principles, your understanding of techniques. Doesn't have to be overly complicated, but that's your kind of theory, but mixed with this kind of very intuitive, very impulsive, very creative way of working. And I think for me, my painting is at its best, and I love it the most when it's kind of somewhere in between the two. Like I'm using the theory to allow the creativity to really come out. It's kind of that sort of balance between the two. I've got my big mop brush because I don't want to get caught up in detail. Almost think of this stage as we're not even painting the subject, we're laying down kind of the foundations or blocking the subject in. I'm going to go Indian yellow, and I'll talk as much as I can about colour as I paint. Loads of water, loads and loads of water. Better to start too light and have to go darker than go too dark too quickly. That's one of the biggest mistakes we can make. So loads of water, loads of Indian yellow. In terms of how my studio feels and how it's organised is really important. I think for me, I know some artist studios, they don't mind kind of mess everywhere and craziness everywhere. I have had that. It doesn't work for me nowadays. I need like a clear space and I need not too much visual clutter everywhere. This is if I'm being, very picky about it. The painting space, both physically and mentally and emotionally, is almost like a sacred space, and you kind of have to get into that space and get into that zone. And I have a few ways of doing that. One is making sure, as I said, that I have kind of carved out this little block of time at least, that I'm a painter just in this little moment, and I can leave everything else behind. And there's little things that help me just kind of get present and in the room. So I might burn a little bit of incense because it just kind of sets the mood. And if we do that at the start of every session, it kind of, puts you in the mindset. It's like, right, I'm painting. This is like my thing that I'm doing. This is my little routine or my ritual to kind of get me into it. I only really need to reserve the white of the page around here and a little bit around the eye. Aside from that, we can just kind of get it on everywhere. So yellow's great because it's quite transparent and quite a weak colour. And what's nice about that is you can kind of map out your painting fairly quickly. without committing too heavily. So I'm kind of mapping the painting out. Notice I'm trying to leave lots of whites of the page here because we want that area to really glow. It doesn't matter if we go into the shadow areas. I just don't want to go too dark, that's the big thing. And this yellow at the moment looks quite cool. Just get everything kind of covered. Leave more whites than you think you need because you can always get rid of them. So I might try and leave a little bit more white around here. One of the big, I think, misconceptions of watercolour is that it's very unforgiving. And whilst it can be unforgiving once it's dried, as long as there's loads of water and pigment on the page, watercolour is a much more forgiving medium than I think a lot of people think. You can pull stuff out, you can push it around. The clue's kind of in the name. Water and colour makes watercolour a lot easier to paint. So the act of using watercolour itself I find massively inspiring. Quite often these days I do like to paint a little bit of everything, a little bit of all subjects, but the thing that usually unites them is that I see something in the subject that I think, oh, there's a great opportunity for like a big area of kind of wet into wet work, or I could do some really lovely loose brush strokes in that area there. So it's slightly driven by just a love of the medium itself. And then I do enjoy the challenge of trying to capture the light and capture the atmosphere of a scene, because I feel like light can be so evocative and so emotive. So that for me is always at the heart of things. And when I look back, even at my very early work, even at school, I didn't realise it at the time, but I was always kind of fascinated by the light and the way that it creates atmosphere and creates depth, and the way it kind of hits objects and illuminates them in different ways, and the softness of the shadows, all of these things that are wrapped up in trying to capture the light. So that's kind of the first stage of stage one, is just kind of map things out, get a feel for it. Whites of the page left. I'm always bearing in mind what it is that I want to achieve in my painting. I want to keep it loose, I want to keep it fresh, I don't want to get too heavy and too dark with it, and I want to let the medium kind of do its thing and really sing out. So that's always at the heart of what I'm doing here. So very, very watery, kind of tea consistency. Next, I'm going to bring up the paint consistency to kind of maybe like full fat milk, and start to introduce a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of the cool transparent red, which is quinacridone rose. And now we can start to do this sort of thing. So I'm not painting the shadows, I'm just going a little bit darker within the light area, and we're just letting all of the paint run, and we're just building in a bit more form. I would like to say that I'm the sort of artist that has loads of sketchbooks lying around in the studio. I'm always experimenting in my sketchbook. I would love to do that, partly due to time, and I think also kind of the perception of pressure of being a professional artist, that I should always be producing an end result. I tend to, when I'm in the studio, just paint paintings. I think maybe at some point, if I have a little bit more time freedom, I could imagine experimenting in the sketchbook a little bit more, trying things out. But as it stands, I kind of just get on with painting in the studio. Now I'm coming up to what I would say is like single cream paint consistency. Indian yellow and the quinacridone red, so dead simple colour-wise. Now the page has dried a little bit, mixed with the fact that I am using a slightly creamier paint consistency. When I put a colour in like this, we'll still get a lovely wet into wet feeling, but it won't spread out as far. So the first wash with loads of water, all the colours mingle together completely. Here the wash has dried a little bit, and I'm using a thicker paint consistency, so we have just a little bit more control. I want it to be a bit more yellow than it is orange. Even if you've only got maybe 6 colours, really play around with how they interact with each other, so colour mixing, but without going heavy into colour theory. You know, what happens if I mix a cool blue with that yellow versus I mix a warm blue with that yellow? What happens if I add more water, I add more pigment? Just play, and get to know your materials. That's going to be a really important part of painting for you. So you could start putting in spots now, but if you put in the spots too soon, they obviously completely dissolve into the surrounding area, and that's obviously going to cause problems. But if we just time it right, and I'm constantly looking at how much water's on the page here, if there's too much water there, when I put in a spot, it's going to just shoot. And not only will the spot disappear, it'll also change the tone of that area. And that's probably one of the most important things about this early stage. Is the biggest mistake I see people making with watercolour is that they start going too dark, i.e. too thick with paint consistency too quickly. And the structure of light and shadow, or the pattern of light and shadow, is what provides structure. So the big shadow shape here, the big light shape there, that's what's going to make this painting work. If my shadow tones start creeping into my light areas, we lose the underlying structure of light and shadow and the painting falls apart. When it comes to painting, I'm actually quite impatient. I like a result to appear fairly quickly, or at least see that I'm on the way to some sort of result that I'm going to be happy with. If I'm not, it tends to get thrown away fairly quickly, and I tend to work very, very quickly as a result. I think firstly, I like working quickly because it doesn't allow too much time for overthinking. It kind of encourages a slightly looser, more painterly, more intuitive way of working. I think also though with watercolour, what I love about watercolour is watercolour itself often dictates the pace of a painting, and I always liken it, certainly in the way I work, like you get ready to paint, you start painting, and that's it then. You're into the roller coaster of watercolour. You know, you've got to roll with it while it's wet, and then it gets to a point where you can't do any more, and the medium says stop, and that's it. And you get to the end of the painting, and you either like it or you don't. You can't really just keep piling on paint to make it better like you can with some of the other mediums. And I really like that kind of roller coaster and the rhythm of a painting. We're at a really nice time here, so letting the brush do a lot of the work. These watercolour brushes are so lovely in the way that they behave. We're taking some of these lovely colours here and starting to introduce some of the spots. Don't overthink it, just pick some of your favourite ones. We're not trying to replicate every element of the subject. I might pick a couple of spots where I push the bias towards being a bit more blue, so that's kind of a warm browny colour. Now I'm going to mix a bit more of the French ultramarine off to one side, and might just give us a slightly different feel. So obviously there's going to be loads of artists throughout history that I've drawn inspiration from at one point or another, but one artist that always stands out for me is Sorolla. I'm a huge fan of his work. There's so much colour in his painting that I found it very inspiring that you can do extremely colourful paintings and really push like the saturation and the chroma of colour, but without making it garish. Just everything about his work I found fascinating, and such an ability to capture kind of light and atmosphere. You can see now that we could go on and start drifting into the shadow side, starting to really make it come to life. But I'm going to stick to my process. We're going to get rid of all of this water along here so it doesn't shoot back up into the painting. I'm going to get a hairdryer on it to get it bone dry before we then go into the gentle shadows, the deep shadows, and then little finishing touches. So I think when I found myself in this kind of more fine art world, if we want to keep calling it that, and more representational work, which again is something that I always felt was maybe boring in inverted commas, just painting things kind of as they are, representational, but then found it to be extremely exciting and also wildly open to creativity. Just because you are painting a thing, you don't have to make it exactly like the thing, and that introduced me to all of these kind of concepts, and through that it also introduced me into this idea of it's a bit of a buzzword, but kind of loose painting and painterly painting. So these are paintings that are not necessarily highly refined with lots of layers, but they're more this kind of, maybe you can see the brush marks, so you can very much see it's a painting. It's a loose collection of washes and marks that kind of give the illusion of your subject. It's this kind of style of painting really spoke to me, and since that time, it's the thing that I'm forever pursuing now, is can I make my paintings feel like more loose and more painterly? How far can I push these brushstrokes and these washes to the point of almost the image almost falling apart, but yet it still kind of represents your subject. So that first wash, I was using a lot of water, and even a gum block like this, which is effectively like a stretch bit of paper, did buckle a fair amount. However, on drying, it's all settled down a lot. There's still little bits. For the way that I work, I don't mind that. Some people like their paper to be completely flat. The only point I'll make is if you're using very heavily granulating pigments and your paper starts getting really wavy, the granulation will settle like in the valleys of the paper, and it can make some not so great looking marks. It can make some interesting effects, but it's just something to be aware of. Right, we're just going to go for it. Just getting the right paint consistency, and we're kind of into here now. So what's this shadow doing as it falls down the face? All of this is in shadow here. I've added more blue so it kind of cools down. We're going to come into here. Really strange part of the painting. Oh, people always panic at this stage. But notice what the watercolour's doing. It's all starting to run together in a really beautiful way. In watercolour specifically, the most key element that opens up watercolour to people is understanding paint consistency. If you focus on tonal values and paint consistency, you're off to the best start in watercolour. So paint consistency is how it feels on the palette. Is it very watery? Is it milky, creamy, thick like Marmite? And then how wet is your page? And the interaction between those two characteristics is really important. One other little bonus bit of material that I haven't mentioned is a spray bottle, and because I want to work very wet into wet, we can actually keep this area alive for a little bit longer by just getting some more moisture on it, and it keeps it workable for a nice amount of time. I've always had like a real curiosity and kind of a thirst for knowledge and for learning, and with painting, that is something that I'm really excited and really passionate about. It's not been like a hard job for me to really get stuck into learning off my own back. So whether that's reading books, studying other artists, both contemporary and in the past, like watching videos, and also just, I suppose, analysing my own processes and my own work. And then through that, actually, for teaching other people has significantly improved my own practice as well. Having to articulate what I'm doing all the time, having to explain processes and ideas in many different ways to many different people, I think has really given me a much deeper understanding of the kind of foundational principles that apply to all of us, but it's also given me a really good insight into my own mindset and the way that I think about painting. So when all of those things kind of come together and get wrapped up, it's been a really significant influence on my work, but it's kind of born out of my own curiosity and my own willingness to learn, if that makes sense. So we've got this lovely dark that comes into the eye here. And because there's a nice dampness on the page, we can start to kind of pop that in. And there are lots of markings in here, don't really want to get to those yet. I'm now drifting into what I would call a deep shadow for this area. So nice and simple, starting to carve out the shapes. If I'm feeling really brave, I think I am, come into some Prussian blue. What I'm trying to do here is encourage the background here to run a little bit into the animal, so we get sort of a soft or lost edge there. So with watercolour particularly, because of this kind of roller coaster ride and the rhythm of a painting, the medium really does in many ways dictate when the painting is finished. It's almost like in watercolour I can't really do any more, because if I do, I'm going to start muddying the paint, or it will have too many layers, it will become overworked. And particularly in the way that also I like to work is that I like large areas to be almost kind of semi-abstract with maybe just a little bit of refinement in some place. So I tend to refine the focal point, and then that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable leaving other areas abstract, rather than trying to render every single part of the painting to the same level of finish or the same degree of refinement. I like to play around with abstract versus refined. Into the darks, but they don't have to be super dark. Even though they're really dark on the photo, doesn't mean we have to make them that dark in the painting. Like, what are we trying to do as the painter that might be different from the photo? Soften edges with a damp brush if we need to. They come out too hard edged. And going in here. Still letting the paint run, but just in a smaller area. So we're still working wet into wet, but just within a smaller area. That's the way I like to think about it. I think wherever you are on your painting journey, but particularly at the start, I think it's really important to understand that theory is a really important part of painting. And I'm always wary of saying this because I think it can put people off, and it can also feel a bit opposing to what people think that painting is. And you might also think that, oh, if I focus too heavily on theory, I won't be really creative and produce really exciting work that is an expression of what I want to say, all of this stuff. But actually, if you flip that around and think of theory as being the tools that enable you to express yourself better. Like if you've got a solid foundation in theory, it's like a springboard for you then to be able to express yourself. And I'm really a big believer in theory for painting's sake, not just for the sake of theory. Just because it's an eye doesn't mean we want to overstate it. I want to keep it fairly simple. Shadow falling off the brow onto the eye itself. And then we're into some of the darker colours. Even though I'm working with smaller shapes, I'm still trying to work with brush marks. I'm not trying to labour the paint too heavily. I'm trying to work with little marks and little flicks just to keep everything kind of lively and energetic. but each mark is a little bit more considered now. I'm not sort of working the paint, but every mark is sort of almost do the mark, sit back, how does it look within the painting? Does it need a little bit more, yes or no? Okay, so I'm going to use a palette knife. If you've got a sharp end to your brush or a sharp fingernail, it can work. We need to be quite harsh with it, so it can feel a little bit scary, but we'll start somewhere that's less in the middle and just kind of scratch out like that. We don't need loads, it's easy to go overboard. It's just enough to break this area up, and I think the timing is just right. It's nearly dry, and there's a big heavy kind of dark there, which putting some whiskers over the top of is quite nice, because it's kind of breaking it up a little bit. It feels really scary, but the more confidently you do it, the better. It's when you're a little bit too timid with it that it makes a bit of a mess of things. It also, I don't always like watercolour to be super neat, and by doing this sort of thing, it kind of roughs it up a little bit. I think I've lost the opportunity to do it in most places, but even a little flick over the eye or something like that. Persistence, like I think there are a few people in the world that are born with like a natural aptitude, which you might call talent, but I think for most of us, it's just focusing on the right things, working hard and persistence, and you will get there. If you have a vision for what you're painting, you want it to be, like focus on that vision and like persistence in that direction, and you will get there. I really do think it is all learnable. I've taught hundreds of students over the years, and it's all learnable. You can definitely get there. And I think also looking to other artists for inspiration and guidance is really, really important without falling into the trap of comparison. I think, again, finding that balance. Don't look at other artists and feel disheartened. Look at other artists and pull out of it what you like about their work and what you find interesting, and then try and bring that into your own work, but in your own way. Do paint what you love and what you're drawn to and what you're inspired by. There's no point going into a painting if you're not excited in some way to paint it. And for some of you it might be medium driven, for some of you it might be subject driven. Yes, at times you might want to push your boundaries a little bit, tackle some subjects that you don't usually do, but on the whole, you've got to paint what like really fires you up and what really inspires you, and that will lead to the best paintings. Like, the best paintings are not the ones that are most technically perfect. They're the ones that are maybe slightly less technically perfect, but they're painted with like enthusiasm and some energy.